And if we connect marks to who we are, we're going wrong. And that's half the problem, I think, maybe the simplest starting point is if I was to give advice to students in general.
Sure.
Stop defining yourself by your marks, because you're much more than your marks.
Today's conversation is particularly exciting for me because we are not only looking at a particular technical subject, but we are indeed looking into the life of a leader, a visionary. We're looking into leadership itself. And now joining us right here in studio is Andrew Horsfall, who is the CEO of Milpark Education. He is a thought leader in the space, an entrepreneur. And of course, we get to hear a little bit more about his perspective in the education space. Where did your passion for education, or rather contributing in the education space, start?
Well, I suppose it started when I was an academic article trainee at UCT. So one of the years when you become a chartered accountant, you can choose to do articles in the universities and get some experience in academia. And that's kind of where it began. And then after that, I always had on my heart that I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And I met a group of friends that had a similar like-minded view around what they wanted to achieve. And we decided to try something. And the thing that came to mind, because we had all been academic article clerks together, was to try to start an education business. And the opportunity in front of us was training CAs and trying to reimagine how we could train CAs.
Sure.
So it started with the lens being entrepreneurship, but very quickly you learn to, if you want to do something really well, you have to get to understand it really well. And so my sort of passion behind education and the impact education could have started to then grow from there, because each year you start realizing the impact you're having on people, and you start getting the feedback loop of the change that you're able to make. And then you start saying, this is something really meaningful. And I think it's really important when you sort of do something that you find meaning in what you do. And for me, education became something very meaningful for us to sort of find a purpose in.
I mean, having started at that point as a student and looking at how the landscape has evolved right now, what are your views about what that landscape looks like? I can give you a couple of words, lexicon, that I can use to describe education right now. I mean, I look at it and I think evolving, and I look at it and I think, inequality. I look at it and I think huge gaps in terms of service provision, in terms of quality. I look at it and I think, perhaps there's areas in which we should improve education, and there's areas and levers that we should be looking at in order to ensure that our education system is actually preparing global citizens and not just localized citizenship. And I know that on its own is a very sticky conversation right now. But what would you say the landscape looks like right now?
Right now, I mean, in the last sort of couple of years, it's going through tremendous change. I think more so than historically. So I actually think, if you'd asked me, how's it evolved since I started, education was stereotypically a place that everything stayed the same. For generations, education was done the same way, or at least similar ways. And there weren't really these big sort of there wasn't a big impetus for change.
Sure.
And then with COVID sort of catalyzing, this need to think about online as a tool. And then when you think about AI now coming in, disrupting what it means to develop human potential, you start realizing that actually it's fundamentally changing. And I think in the last 3 to 5 years, I've almost just stepped into a situation where, if you're not changing really quickly and not thinking out the box about how education can shift, you're going to struggle as a business. And I think insofar as what it means for students, I think it's becoming a bit of a Wild West, in the sense that no one's necessarily clear what the best way to go about teaching and learning in the future. And so there's this opportunity and this risk, and it's quite a daunting place to be, if I'm honest.
And that's exactly the kind of disruption that you've sort of brought into the education space. I mean, Milpark Education on its own it's attempting, and I want to say that it has carved a way in which education is viewed holistically and not just from a linear point of view. Talk to us a little bit more about how that program is designed and some of the roadmaps and some of the stops along the way that you've had to confront, challenges, perhaps even your own personal challenges that you've had to interact with and interface along the way while trying to carve that road.
I think from my side, to imply that we've achieved this gold standard idea of what we're wanting to do in terms of education would be a little bit naive. I think it's a journey, and I think any authentic process recognizes that it never really ends. And so it's about a process of ongoing improvement towards a very clearly articulated set of goals. So in my mind, we deeply believe at Milpark in holistic learning. And what I mean by that is that we believe in far more than just the functional get you to know stuff. We believe that learning, that actually that's secondary. And actually we can use what you know or what we want to teach you about stuff, but to develop the way you think. And I think if you left institution and you just knew a whole bunch of stuff, but you hadn't been shaped in terms of how you think, I think there's some really big pieces missing in terms of what it means for the rest of your life. And I encourage students who are making decisions to think about that, because it's a shared responsibility. And I think a lot of the time students look to the institutions to just solve the problem. But in reality, change in who you are requires a participation with the student. And if the student chooses to disengage, it's very, very difficult to help them to shift themselves into a different place, because actually you're in control of how you change.
Sure.
So from my side, we are trying to create communities of education where what we're trying to achieve is clearly understood, so students understand their responsibilities in terms of participating. Our goal is to design very intentional learning journeys that are using knowledge, so content, as a scaffold to develop deeper order thinking. And I would be very disappointed if students left our institution with just a functional understanding. Sure. And not with a belief in self and a belief in, or trust in their abilities to think for themselves within varying contexts that are outside of potentially what the content that they learned. Now that's always actually been the goal of higher education institutions. So I don't think I'm saying anything actually unique. But the problem, I think, is that we've generally lost sight of that in the context of functional learning. And AI is now forcing us to reprioritize that. And I think institutions that don't reprioritize that are actually starting to sell or provide students solutions that are not going to have a long-term future. In terms of what we learned along the way, I think, this was always, I suppose, deeply connected to our context, because, as I said in the beginning, I didn't really come from a traditional educational background, in the sense that I didn't study education. I'm a chartered accountant, and I was being entrepreneurial. So when you're entrepreneurial and you have to survive, you kind of go back to first principles and you say, what do I need to do here? And I think as a team, we started to challenge some of the assumptions that are sort of embedded in what higher education is. And that allowed us to sort of break some basics that I think were constraining what you need to be able to do in higher education. And I think over time, we started to realize that actually at the most distilled version of it, learning ultimately is this idea of taking risks in your mind. Because for you to change how you think, you have to let go of what you did think, or you have to accept new things. And that's scary, because it means potentially recognizing that you weren't what you thought you were before. And for you to be able to move towards something, you have to let go of what your identity was before. And I know it sounds very philosophical, but that's literally what goes on in students' minds. They don't realize it, they don't necessarily articulate it that way, but they are resistant to change because they don't feel safe and they don't believe in themselves. And therefore they just say to us, tell us what we need to know. And we go, no, it's not about what you need to know, it's how you think, which means you've got to shift. And the challenge with students is that if you're insecure, you don't ever want to shift. And what that means is that we have to focus hugely on creating an enabling context that makes them feel secure. And that's part of how we connect with them, how we tell them that we actually all don't have this thing sorted out. Like actually we all are figuring it out. And actually the people that look all packaged and put together are in themselves, to be honest, not packaged and put together. So there's nothing actually wrong with feeling a bit uncomfortable. It's about how you embrace that discomfort. But to embrace the discomfort, you got to feel like you're not going to get smacked. And part of that is how we do assessments, how we feed back on assessments, and how we support them in terms of their psychosocial support. So being available to recognize that this is hard and that's okay, but there's no other way to do this. And we need to go through that process of change with you. And I think for me, that was you asked me that was the DNA of what we figured out. How that plays out in the design and how it plays out in the creation of the student experiences differs based on the context of the course you're building and what you're trying to achieve. But that thread, I think, is pervasive and common and uniquely relevant for South Africa. And the reason I say that is because actually, when I also unpack what we mean by disadvantage, which is real, but I often get frustrated because we talk about disadvantage too superficially. We don't talk about what really has been disadvantaged. We talk about it in terms of wealth and money and opportunity, all nice words. But for me, what matters is what is the ultimate, at the core of it, what is the ultimate impact that disadvantage has had on people. And in an educational context, for me, it comes down to this term I use, which is it's created a degree of academic insecurity. People who don't feel good enough. And they don't feel good enough for many societal factors, but that impacts their ability to learn. And so we have to basically look at them and say, well, with a lot of different ways, but essentially say to them, you are good enough. There's nothing inherently inferior about you, but your way of approaching this is being held back by your stance to how you see yourself. And what we want to spend time on is solving for that, because if we solve for that, I believe we can play a role as an institution in making huge headways in sort of trying to address the true disadvantage we're talking about in this country.
Andrew, it's very interesting for me that the entire program itself takes into consideration the South African context, with all its disparities, with all its, privileges or disadvantages. And I keep asking myself this question that, does this intentional, very present, very forward-thinking solutions that we're seeing in education, do those really speak to the readiness of industry in South Africa? Because we are developing active participants of our economy. We are developing future leaders. I keep asking myself, is South Africa and industry and labor structurally and perhaps even functionally ready to receive these kinds and this caliber of students that's coming out of the likes of Milpark Education?
Yeah, well, I don't want to oversell it. I think we are working really hard at establishing students' identity so that they can do things like lifelong learn, which I would reorganize as saying ongoing reflection and change over a course of a lifetime is what I would define as lifelong learning. And if you ask me, are companies ready for that type of a person? I think they're desperate for that type of a person. And I think actually that's all they want at the end of the day. I think what they get is that chaos they have to navigate, and they don't know how to navigate it because they aren't academic institutions. And this isn't even an academic problem. And in actual fact, to your primary point, I think we in South Africa as tertiary institutions have to do far more than the average tertiary institution around the world, because we have to respond to the structural challenges that are inherent in South Africa. And so for me to make a statement that we are a global educational institution would be naive, because there are such unique needs in South Africa that for us to cater to both simultaneously is inauthentic. You have to give up one for the other. And in my mind, if your focus is South African-centric, you actually have to change what you are as an institution and take responsibilities on that you wouldn't normally have to take on if you're focusing on a global context. And I think for me, that speaks to the need that the employers themselves also have, because they are also dealing with the struggle with human potential and unlocking human potential. And so for me, we're aligned at the core. But again, they don't necessarily articulate it the same way I am. And so they don't, if you go speak to them, they may not necessarily recognize this, but I suspect that if I could go sit with a corporate and say, do you want people who may not know everything technically, and they may not have as much knowledge? And the reason I say that is because, remember, everything's a trade-off, which means if you want to focus on these skills within a limited time, you've got to then deprioritize other things.
Sure.
So, and again, I will always push back at institutions and say we can do it all, because you can't do it all. You've got to pick your trade-offs. I think if I went to corporates and said to them, do you want to focus on, do you want students who have that, or do you want students to have the knowledge, starting knowledge? I think they're going to say, we want the inherent underlying skills of thinking,
and
which
capacity.
which comes down to, in my mind, people who believe in themselves so that they can reflect and learn and adapt, so the corporate can properly engage with them and participate with them.
Let's talk about learning. It's one of your passion subjects. What exactly, Andrew, is learning? And what does learning look like for the South African adult right now? Embarking in especially alternative education, in innovative education. What does that process look like?
Well, I mean, when you ask me what learning is, and again, I want to be very clear, I'm not a traditional academic, and I have definitely not studied any educational programs. But this comes from my perception of what we're trying to figure out around the student challenges that we face. And for me, if I distilled learning to its core, for me, learning is going through a process of personal change that shows you what you can do and gives you the confidence to move into places that you otherwise wouldn't have. So and this is important. If you look at Milpark's vision statement, we talk about unlocking existing human potential. In other words, we're very comfortable in recognizing that we don't bring the potential in you. You have that potential. And for me, I want to catalyze moments in your life that make you realize what sits there that you can now release. And if you can do that, you're freed to be more, notwithstanding us, because you go on. Because think about it, even if you do a degree with us, maybe you do 4 years, but your life 40, 50 years, what happens thereafter? And so our responsibility is to use that window of time to catalyze something in you that will give you the potential into the future. And that'll hopefully, and this doesn't work perfectly for everybody, but it will hopefully encourage, on average, more students that leave Milpark to be comfortable with change, to be comfortable with being wrong, being okay with reflection, so that they can go, oh, I tried that didn't work. What can I now do to improve? Rather than just tell me what to do. I'm waiting for you to feed into me. And that speaks to things like leadership, and because to be confident as a leader, you have to have an assertive stance around leading. I'm not saying to control people, more to say you need to have views and opinions, and you need to be able to put them down and interrogate them, and you need to have debates with people around them. I mean, if you don't believe in yourself, will you ever have debates with people?
No.
Will you ever bring your ideas?
No.
Will you ever pressure test your ideas in an environment where you think everyone else is better than you? So what happens to you?
Sure.
You get stuck in a very simple role, and that becomes your life. And then you get trapped.
One of the things that you often talk about is the role of privilege in how we perceive and receive information. And this is very closely aligned, to people's learning culture. And I suppose even to the South African landscape's learning culture that is very top down. Teacher gives information, students receive. And without really looking into that process and how that process or the undefined process actually affects the learner's ability to perceive and receive information. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so if you accept my premise,
yes,
particularly in South Africa, and the premise is that we have a disproportionate amount of academically insecure students, and that would be for whatever reason, and it's maybe could be I grew up in a very difficult position in my life, and I've had to prioritize other things. It could be misguided pressure, and I say this carefully, but marks, a fixation on marks, cause people to focus on the wrong things.
Yeah.
And then if a parent doesn't know better and they put pressure on their kid to get marks, then they could jeopardize their ability to actually think, because it's actually easy to play the game of getting marks compared to do you understand. So I don't want to presume into the reasons why. Obviously, apartheid and our past played a massive role in that. But I think it perpetuates, and I think it's not just that. But let's assume there's a premise that a huge number of people, and the other thing is our struggling primary school, pre-primary school, and sort of secondary school education systems, because they have actually a developmental role that we are, as an institution, as a higher education institution, supposed to be able to leverage off. And if they aren't working the way they're supposed to work and playing their role in society the way they are systematically, then what you're going to be left with is us having to step into that more, and also more and more academically insecure students. And so for me, if you accept that premise, then you can't have a situation where you have universities that have, I don't know, like PhD lecturers on the stage that dress up in suits and talk as if they know what's going on, even though they themselves had their own struggles, and they aren't authentically connecting because they almost use those, I don't know, societal structures of formality to almost not even themselves have to be vulnerable. And then, if a student in a classroom sees the person teaching them as being not vulnerable and not authentic, then they're going to feel like they're not good enough, because they're going to think, I'm not that. I can't relate to that. How am I going to ever be like that? Therefore, I'm not good enough. Therefore, it must be me. When actually it's a function of the structure. And so for me, big brands, heraldry, all these intimidating contexts, I dismiss them. I mean, when I started my business in education early on, I think we were actually intentional. I would wear shorts and shirts, and I would go and I would sit. We'd play some jokes. I'd sit with the students as if I was a student, and they wouldn't even know. And they were like, "Where's the lecturer?" And then we'd get up to the stage like, "Hey, I'm the lecturer," because what I was trying to do is subordinate the role of a lecturer to be more of a facilitator and a participant and a co-equal. And then you've got to be comfortable saying, "Yeah, I'm wrong. I see your point of view," or actually, I don't have the answer to that question. That's okay. Like, I'll figure it out and help you, because that shows them that you don't have all the answers, because you don't have all the answers.
Sure.
I want to find human-centric teachers.
Sure.
And what often you find with teachers is you get two sort of stereotypical archetypes. You get teachers that are there because they themselves want to learn, not because they're there for the students. They're like, I like the idea of learning, and this is a learning institution, so I want to be there. But actually, the whole point of me being there is that I can continue my own learning journey. And initially, it's quite nice, but then in time, they're like, now I'm bored because I've done all my learning, and now I wasn't here for the students in the first place. Now what happens? And then it becomes a very functional learning environment. And then you get student lecturers that are there because they want to change people.
That is phenomenal.
But that's not what's on their CV, right? Because they might have the same CVs, or the one might look more impressive on a CV. But our choices in our institution are to say, who are the people-centric lecturers? Lecturer is actually probably the wrong word. People-centric teachers. I like the word teacher more than lecturer, because a lecturer implies, like, I already have a seniority of you. I'm going to lecture you. I'm imposing something. Yeah, exactly. Whereas for me, a teacher is a much better descriptor of what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Andrew, I want to come back to the unlocking potential thing. I think there's so much to actually deal with there. But let's just come back to the academically insecure concept. Somebody may be listening to this and thinking, right, we're talking academically insecure, but against what standard, really?
The idea for me is that people have different degrees of confidence in themselves, which impacts their ability to learn and impacts their ability to develop. And I think what people, I mean, do you know that all the literature in education will say that pausing progression appropriately creates better outcomes in the long run. So let's use an example. You have a classroom and we pass everybody, we move them forward. If you track people where you like their performance over time, and they all just get passed, or at least they get average results, but they get moved to the next grade. So let's say you get even a 50 traditional pass, and you move forward. The people that started with a 50 will never catch up to the people that were getting 80s, because they layer foundation upon foundation upon foundation. They get archetyped as being not capable students. But then for people that, if they've done studies, that if you hold back is maybe the wrong word, it's got weight. If you pause or force them to properly understand, and that might come at a cost, slowing them down.
You mean slowing the
learning down, so that they actually properly understand, as opposed to pass the test. Because remember, you assume, this is the other thing everyone misses about education, is that everyone assumes if you pass the test, you are being educated. And actually, you can get people getting 80s that don't get an education. It's not about, because that's a game. I always say to my students, tests are a game. They're not really, we try and connect them to the genuine education, but there's not a strong correlation.
You do realize that's quite a sticky one, right? Because it speaks straight to the structure of impact and assessment. Yeah, anyway.
But let me just, I want to just close that idea out. So if a student is held back or is forced to develop a proper understanding before they progress, they catch up to their peer group. Which means what we're doing by design is systematically keeping people into an inferior category of their potential.
So what happens to the group that they are catching up to?
So let's assume everyone does 80. I'm just creating a simplistic scenario for the explanation of the point. But let's assume everyone does 80, right? And they don't, but let's just assume for the sake of argument. And this student does 50.
Sure.
If you appropriately hold that student back to understand at that stage, over time they catch up to the 80 group. Whereas if you don't appropriately hold them back, they'll track 50 the whole way through, which means their potential never gets unlocked. And people don't realize that, because you would see being held back as a failing in you. But actually, sometimes being held back is the best thing we can do for you to ensure you properly understand so that you can unlock your proper potential.
So then, Andrew, what happens to the 80? I think, I'm sorry, I could be wrong, but I am seeing a constraint in that whole entire ecosystem. If the 50 is given that much attention, there's so much intention, on getting them to unlock their potential. What happens to the 80? Because surely the 80 has their own potential that must continue to be unlocked.
This goes back to privilege. If you are privileged, so let's say you are academically secure, you'll be fine no matter what.
Right.
So why do I spend all my resources on you when you're going to be fine no matter what? And actually, we can have, and this does happen in institutions, we can have all the 80s and we can have a great conversation. We can enjoy it. It's therapeutic because I feel good. I've had this deep conversation with these people. They've enhanced their learning. I've enhanced my learning, but they would have been fine anyway. So what's the role? Is my role as an institution to play in the elite space and we all pat ourselves on the back? Or is my role to dive into the unlocked human potential to unlock it? And obviously, I could make that statement broadly for the world, but in South Africa, what's my role? What's the better place for me to play? We've limited resources. We know where the real issues lie. Why are we wasting our time at the top when they're going to be fine anyway? And actually, that just reinforces privilege.
I am absolutely overwhelmed. I am overwhelmed at how much such wisdom has been hiding in plain sight. And I just want to say congratulations right in the middle of what we're trying to do here, for having actually pinpointed the real obstacle in the learning space, because it's exactly that. It's not, it's this thing of ignoring, unlocking potential and thinking that, releasing PhDs and the number of academic qualifications that we release and we're able to record is actually what we should measure ourselves in. And perhaps a great way to sort of conclude our conversation, Andrew, is to look at, something that you said, which I thought, if somebody from the structural, traditional sort of assessment space hears this, they're probably going to turn. How do we measure education, really? If we're talking unlocking potential, if we're talking, different ways of developing citizens and learning in people, how do we really measure education then, if it's not with the 80% versus the 50?
Well, you're asking a very challenging question, because if you make statements around all these softer skills, all these intangible values, and not content, which is easy to measure, it puts the responsibility on the institution to think much more broadly around how they assess. And that is not a simple thing. It's not like you just go, okay, I'm going to pick, instead of picking these set of assessments, I'm going to pick those set of assessments. We haven't really been able to figure out what the best way to do this is. There's a lot of research done on this, and there are definitely clear ways that are better than not. But I'll make the reverse statement, which is this. If you're measuring only these things, you're going to get only these things. And so you've got to, and part of the emphasis can't be on these things. If you want a student to carry the duality of like my potential is being developed and the marks, then you have to de-emphasize marks. And that's part of what I did in my classroom, was to say to them, guys, I mean, I would say to them straight, I said to them, like getting 50, I got 50s, right? And does the 50 really matter? Because I know you need to open the door, you need a degree. I understand that. And I know theoretically, like getting a really good degree signals something to an employer. And so in theory, but actually, if you have an interview with an employer and you showcase a degree of internal self-assurance and wisdom, and I think this employer is going to take you no matter what, because actually that's what they're looking for.
And it means you're scalable.
Yes.
It means you're teachable, adaptable.
Exactly. You've got to then de-emphasize marks as being the arbitrator of a person. And I think that's the big thing for me.
Right.
I have got huge stories of people that barely scrape through. You'd say to them they are not academic, but they are immensely successful. And I'll give you, like, often the people that struggle with themselves, and because it's not easy for them, and they have to figure out what works and doesn't work, and they have to relate to the challenge, they're the best leaders because they can empathize. And so for me, we think marks define you, but I'm like, marks is just a game. We need to break ourselves away from marks. Yes, it's a game we've got to take seriously on a level, but it's just a game. And if we connect marks to who we are, we're going wrong. And that's half the problem, I think, maybe the simplest starting point is, if I was to give advice to students in general, stop defining yourself by your marks, because you're much more than your marks.
Can we at least, Andrew, before I let you go, also speak to the students to whom marks come naturally, to also affirm them so that they're not feeling excluded, from this new normal that we are crafting, which is very necessary contextually?
But again, I'll say to them, marks don't define you. On the reverse, don't get arrogant just because you got good marks, because you have to work with people, and actually, what do marks mean? Any actual person in the real world that has been in business or employed for more than a couple of years realizes that what matters was never the marks. And I don't think anyone would dispute that statement. And so, to what degree can you use your marks as leverage or as a recognition of some sort of inherent thing? I dispute that. And I think it actually is dangerous because it implies something about you that isn't complete. Because I think you may be amazing in terms of playing the game, but what about all the other skills you need to learn? And there's so many more skills that are important than just academic skills to becoming a successful person. And I think for me, again, we all use education as the vehicle for becoming a successful person. That's the idea, right? But education is playing one element in who you need to become.
Development
yes,
of a person.
But everyone pins their hopes on that. That's the thing. But it can't just be the thing if it's only one-dimensional. So for me, we've got to go bigger, and we've got to ask ourselves bigger questions.
Perhaps then even consider investment in some of the adjacent levers, like, the social aspect, the home aspect, the relational aspect of it.
In my mind, the biggest levers to success are the family environment. And so for me, we should be prioritizing not higher education. We should be prioritizing preschool education, and we should be prioritizing family environments and trying to create some way of creating a stability there. And I will be honest, I also think it needs to be set in terms of tone. In other words, we need our leaders to stand up and say, this matters. It actually matters more for your child's success than education. Get the home right. Because the challenges we actually have largely manifest out of struggling home environments.
Such a chicken and egg, though. It's such a chicken and egg, Andrew, because somebody that is sitting in a tertiary institution right now, they are wanting to redress the very problem of the struggles that they've had to go through as a child. And they're wanting to use education as a lever to redress that.
Yeah, and it can be. And so I suppose it depends at what point we want to solve the problem. If you say, like to us, my role in higher education is to accept what I'm given. I can't control more than that. That's a political question, right? I go, okay, this is what I need to do. And I respond to that, and I create the best enabling environment I can, given the context that we're working within. And that's what we're doing. Mm-hmm. So to the people that want redress or want us to try to help, given the realities of that they're facing, we're doing our damnedest at Milpark. We're definitely doing our damnedest. Can we wave a magic wand? No. But can we create opportunities for you to see yourself differently? Yes. And I think that that's more important than so many other things. But if you ask the bigger question, what do we need to do overall, it has to go deeper. And so I don't want to create a false sense that we can solve all the problems here.
Sure.
But I will work with what we have, and I'm very comfortable in recognizing that we have a role to play.
Let me tell you, if you are listening right now and you're not transformed in your thinking, you're not transformed in the plans that you made before you clicked play on this podcast, I don't know what else needs to happen, because the CEO of Milpark Education, Andrew Horsfall, right here in this particular episode, has gone and rewritten the rules of how I, as an individual, am going to look at education, rewritten the rules of how I, as an individual, am going to advocate for education. South Africa's education system is, of course, a complex but evolving landscape, and this conversation has just contributed to the shifting mindset and certainly to a transformation of a mind and a way in which we view education. Andrew, thank you so much.